When it comes to custom Raspberry Pi builds, there seems to be no limit with what you can do with customization. Today, we're going to test those limits with my very first experience ever with a Raspberry Pi build. This one is called the MintyPi. Here's my experience building it on the RetroFix. Well, as you've guessed by now, we are building a Raspberry Pi retro gaming machine inside an Altoids tin can. Grab some rubbing alcohol and clean out your tin, prepping it for the build. Next, you want to grab these three parts. The button PCB, which is made by Helder. This is a fantastic board. As you can see, it's very detailed and very clean, and I just like the look of the matte black. You notice it has these nubs on the side. These are from the factory when they come connected to other boards and they snap apart. So we're just going to take a file and sand that down in a little bit. Here's the front plate for the buttons, and you're going to need a Raspberry Pi Zero. I went with a Raspberry Pi Zero W, so that does have the wireless involved, so you have Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. Makes it much more easier to manipulate the Pi. I grabbed a set of files and just went to work on the sides of the board. We wanted to make sure that this was smooth so everything would fit nice and snug inside. Should look like this after you're done filing, nice and smooth. Next, I grabbed the bag full of the screws, the hinge, and the L&R template and separated them. Now it's time to screw the button PCB to the front housing for the buttons. There are 3 of these, so you'll want to screw 2 at the top and 1 on the side. Next, we're going to take the Raspberry Pi and we're going to line it up on the board. Make sure you install it this way, facing down. We're actually going to be soldering all the pins, so you're going to grab some flux and hit all the pads on the PCB board. This is going to allow the solder to flow freely and make it much less of a hassle. Next, we'll take the Raspberry Pi, set it down and screw it down halfway. Then we want to line it up with the pads underneath. You can use the test pads above as a guide to see if it's straight across. Once you have it, tighten it all the way down and it should look like this when you're ready to go. Now it's time to solder these 40 pins to the PCB board. Just go ahead and take your time with this. The flux is going to do most of the work. All you need to do is add a little bit of heat and let the solder flow. You'll notice that I'm not using a lot of solder at first. This is just to make sure that I don't add too much solder, as removing solder from this can be difficult. The solder flows really nicely with that flux. The trick here is to put it in the pinhole and feed the solder to the iron. This allows for the solder to flow to the right place and not become really messy. Just finish up these last few holes and then we can do our continuity test. Here's a quick diagram of what to test to see if your continuity is good. Next, we're going to take the template for the bottom of the tin to show us where to drill our holes for all the ports. Tape up the tin to make sure it doesn't get scratched, and we'll mark all our spots. In the front is the USB and the headphone jack. In the back is the L&R button. I just used a pin to mark where I need to drill. On the side is the USB Type-C and charging light, as you can see marked here. After you feel confident that you've got it marked and ready to go, it's time to drill. Now, it's recommended that you use a drill press. However, I had no access to that, so I had to freehand everything on this one. I took my time and I started with the smallest bit that I have and worked my way up. The drill bit can drift. Just take your time and make sure it doesn't slide around. And once you get that first hole started, it shouldn't be too hard following up. With the ports, I drilled a few holes just to save myself time when trying to file everything down. I drilled 3 holes each in each of the ports. As you can see here, I've stepped all the way up to fit the L&R buttons in perfectly. After everything's been drilled, I put the template back on just to mark what little pieces I had left to take off with the file. I took my fine tip Sharpie and marked the edges so I could make it just as neat as I could. Then came the boring, tedious part of filing it. But if you want to have a nice clean look, this is definitely recommended. When it's done, it should look something like this. Clean the tin again, get rid of all the metal shavings. We don't want anything left behind that could short or damage the board. Next, we're going to take our bracket for the bottom piece for our charging port. Seen here is the board for the USB Type-C and the charging indicator with the wiring harness. It sits on the left and just snaps in like that. Here's the L&R board that we're going to solder to the top of it. You'll see 3 pads, ground, L, and R. All 3 will be need to attached as seen here. We'll solder all 3 of those points, and it should look something like this when we're done. Looks good. Put it back in the housing. Prep our L&R buttons. We'll put the buttons in first. And then we'll put in our bottom board with the charging port. These are all 3D printed pieces, so they're pretty flexible. So we're going to add some hot glue to each of the 4 corners to make sure it stays where it is. Make sure everything's lined up correctly before you tack it down. These L&R buttons were a little bit longer from the factory, so they included in the kit a template to show you where to cut. I used a sharp pair of snips to cut right off the top, and this made it much more low profile without losing any of the tactile feel. And it looks good. This is the wiring harness. Wanted to show you how to plug it in. Make sure that the pins are lined up on the top side. It can only go one way, so if it's not going in, don't force it. Once you have it set correctly, just go ahead and press it all the way in, and you're ready for the next step. This is the back housing for the LCD. What we want to do for these next 2 parts is file it down, even if it feels smooth. We want to make sure that these parts will stay together, and every little bit helps. Keep it clean with some alcohol, and we'll move to the next step. This is the front frame for the LCD. Next, we'll take the LCD housing that's going to be attached to the top part. I used VHB tape, which was recommended to stick it to the top. This stuff holds very well, and this is the orientation that I used. Line it up perfectly and set it on top of the tin and carefully close the top on it. Close it all the way down, careful not to move it, and open it back up when you've pressed down firmly, and it should be set perfectly centered where it needs to be. Press back on there to make sure it's sealed correctly. Next, we're going to attach our speaker. Add our positive and negative wires to the speaker. Solder it to the board in this orientation. The board is clearly labeled, so you shouldn't have any problems here. Remember to always test before you put it all back together. Now it's time to put our buttons in. These custom silicone buttons are awesome, and I was really impressed with the quality. I love these multicolored buttons, and I'm so glad that I ordered these instead of the regular ones. Then we'll put the assembly in and screw it all back together. Next, put your battery in as seen here. And we're going to add some kapton tape to cover the whole underside of the board to make sure that we're not going to short anything out. Attach your LCD ribbon cable and put the final piece on. I just covered the whole thing just to be safe. We'll attach that wiring harness to the top board and set the left side in first after adding our hinge. Just be careful snapping it in, but it should fall in nicely. And add your 4 screws. Attach your LCD. And it'll sit nicely in there. Raise up your hinge before putting the final piece on. This piece just snaps in the 4 corners. Just line it up nice and easy. You'll press on it and they'll kind of snap in 2 stages. You see I press it once and it goes in a little bit. Go all the way around, press it the first time, and then when you're sure that you've got everything lined up, you can press all the way in and you'll see that it just snaps together really nicely. These 3D printed parts really do impress me. And we're done. The hinge will be a little stiff at first, but a little finagling and you should be alright. And here it is. This was my very first Raspberry Pi build, so I didn't know what to expect, and I was super happy with the results. This machine is awesome and I'm still learning about it. If you look down below, these are all the parts you need and the guys that are responsible for it. This was the version 3, and maybe by the time you see this, there's some new revisions. These guys are awesome and they're constantly updating their content. Look in the description to find out where you can purchase your own and build your own, and I'd love to see and hear more from you guys about your experience with your Raspberry Pi builds. Thank you so much for watching. This is Ken with The Retro Fix. You can follow me on Instagram at The Retro Fix. See you next time.